Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now, get comfortable and relax. It all started with a knock on the door at 3 a.m. Everyone knows no good comes from a knock at that hour, but for Lily, it marked the beginning of a nightmare that would blur the line between reality and something far darker. Lily lived in a small, quiet town surrounded by dense woods, the kind of place where secrets seem to cling to the air. She was a writer, renting an old cabin for solitude and inspiration. The locals called it Whispering Pines, a name that seemed poetic but carried a more sinister undertone she'd yet to understand. The first night in the cabin, she noticed odd things. A draft moved through the house despite all the windows being shut tight. A faint, rhythmic tapping seemed to echo from the walls, but stopped whenever she tried to find its source. She chalked it up to her imagination and the creaks of an old house. But then, the knocking began. It was faint at first, like knuckles lightly grazing the wood. By the third night, it was unmistakable. 3 distinct knocks at her front door. Lily peered through the peephole but saw nothing. When she opened the door, the night greeted her in eerie silence, not a single rustle in the trees. The knocks came every night after that, always at 3 a.m. Lily began to dread the hour. She tried ignoring it, covering her ears with pillows, but the sound seemed to grow louder. The worst part wasn't the knocking itself. It was the whispers that came with it. Low, unintelligible murmurs seeped through the walls, a cacophony of voices that seemed to argue and chant all at once. Words were impossible to discern, but Lily swore she heard her name spoken amidst the chaos. One night, unable to take it any longer, she set up her laptop to record. At 3 a.m., the knocking returned, and Lily mustered the courage to throw the door open. Again, nothing. But this time she didn't feel alone. The air felt dense, electric, as if unseen eyes bore into her. She reviewed the footage the next morning, her hands trembling. The video showed her opening the door to an empty porch, but just as she turned away, a shadowy figure emerged at the edge of the screen. It wasn't human. It stood impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and twisted. Its head tilted unnaturally, as if it were staring straight at the camera. And then it moved. The figure melted into the shadows with a fluidity that made her stomach churn. Her blood ran cold when she realized the whispers had continued, even after she closed the door. Determined to leave, Lily packed her bags the next morning. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the cabin seemed to trap her. Every attempt to call for help was met with static, her phone and car mysteriously dead. The forest outside the cabin loomed, its trees gnarled and unnervingly still. That night, the knocking turned into banging, each thud shaking the walls. The whispers erupted into screams. Shadows danced across her room, but there was no light source. And then the figure from the video emerged from the darkness of the hallway. Lily froze, her breath hitching as the creature moved closer. Its face was featureless except for 2 hollow, glowing eyes. Its whispers became clear as it leaned toward her. "You opened the door." She ran, stumbling into the woods, her flashlight flickering as she went deeper and deeper. The shadows followed, their whispers wrapping around her like tendrils. No matter how far she ran, the cabin always seemed to reappear in front of her. Days later, search parties found her sitting on the cabin porch, muttering incoherently. The once bright and curious writer was now a shell of herself, her eyes vacant and sunken. Locals say she never left Whispering Pines. Some claim they see her silhouette through the cabin window at night. Others swear they hear faint knocking if they stray too close. But the bravest, or the most foolish, will tell you they've seen something else. A tall, twisted shadow watching from the tree line, its hollow eyes glowing faintly as it waits for the next person to open the door. Would you open the door if you heard a knock at 3 a.m.? Let me know in the comments below, but be careful. Someone might be listening. While exploring a centuries-old crypt, Daniel found a single candle burning in the darkness. Intrigued, he picked it up, but the flame wouldn't extinguish. That night, the candle reappeared on his bedside table, its flame casting shadows that danced like living things. Whispers filled the room, promising eternal light in exchange for his soul. By morning, Daniel was gone, leaving only the candle, its flame burning brighter than ever. The rain outside hissed against the stone walls, a mournful accompaniment to the crypt's eternal flame. An invitation to a masked ball arrived at Claire's doorstep, though she didn't know the sender. Intrigued, she attended and found herself in a grand hall filled with masked guests. The air was thick with perfume and secrets. As the night wore on, Claire noticed that none of the masks had eye holes. Yet the guests moved as if they could see her. When she tried to leave, a masked figure blocked her path, whispering, "You're not ready to go." The next morning, the hall was empty, and Claire's mask was found among the others. The rain outside softened to a gentle drizzle, its sound mingling with faint echoes of laughter. In the middle of a wide, empty field stood a door with no frame, weathered and ancient. Sam, a farmer, ignored it until one day he found it slightly ajar. Through the crack, he saw a lush garden, vibrant and inviting. But when he stepped through, the door slammed shut behind him, and the garden turned to ash. The field remained empty, but Sam's voice could be heard on quiet nights, begging for the door to open again. The rain fell steadily, soaking the barren field where the mysterious door once stood. Every 50 years, the town of Grey Hollow held a festival unlike any other. Visitors would arrive to find the streets adorned with lanterns, vendors selling peculiar trinkets, and musicians playing haunting melodies. But the townsfolk never spoke, their faces hidden behind masks. Olivia, an investigative journalist, decided to uncover the mystery. She was greeted warmly, offered food and drink, and given a mask of her own. As night fell, the music stopped and the festival-goers gathered in the town square. A single, towering figure emerged, its mask ornate and glowing faintly. One by one, the visitors, those who didn't belong, were brought forward. Olivia's mask was removed, and the crowd gasped in unison. She wasn't one of them. The next morning, the town was deserted, and Olivia's camera was found at the center of the square, its last photo showing her staring in terror as the figure reached for her. The rain fell in a steady rhythm, as if mourning the festival's latest victim. At the edge of a cliff, a lighthouse that had stood for centuries was said to be cursed. Eleanor, a marine biologist, rented a nearby cottage to study the area's unique marine life. Each night, the lighthouse's beacon lit up despite its abandonment, casting eerie shadows across the waves. One stormy evening, Eleanor ventured inside. The air smelled of salt and decay, and the walls were covered in carvings of ships lost at sea. In the keeper's quarters, she found a journal filled with desperate pleas for forgiveness. As she turned the pages, she heard footsteps echoing in the stairwell. Reaching the top, she saw the ghostly figure of the last keeper, his face twisted in anguish. He pointed to the ocean where phantom ships sailed silently. Eleanor fled, but the light followed her every night after, illuminating her home as if marking her. Thunder rumbled in the distance, the storm outside echoing the cries of the lost. Deep in the wilderness, there was a forest where people went to forget. Legends said that if you spoke your name aloud there, it would vanish from memory, freeing you from your past. Jacob, burdened by guilt, entered the forest one autumn evening. As he walked, the trees seemed to whisper, their leaves rustling like voices. He whispered his name, and the wind carried it away. For a moment he felt peace, But then he noticed the forest growing darker, the paths twisting unnaturally. Figures began to emerge, shadowy and featureless, their hands reaching for him. They had given up their names long ago, and now they sought his. When Jacob's friends found his journal weeks later, the final entry read, "I am nothing." The rain began to fall, the droplets tapping like faint whispers on the forest floor. On a desolate road, a mansion stood hidden behind overgrown hedges. Clara, a real estate agent, was tasked with preparing it for sale. The house's grandeur was marred by an unsettling silence, broken only by the creak of floorboards. Each room held relics of its past owners, untouched and eerie. In the master bedroom, Clara found a diary chronicling the lives of a family who had lived there decades ago. The entries became erratic, detailing strange noises, moving shadows, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. That night, Clara stayed to finish her work, but as she slept, she heard footsteps in the hallway. The diary was found in her car the next day. The final page hastily scrawled, "The house is alive." The rain outside mingled with the steady drip of water from the house's leaky roof, a haunting reminder of its presence. Late one evening, Samuel boarded a train heading home after a long day. The passengers were oddly quiet, their faces obscured by the dim light. As the train sped through the countryside, Samuel realized it wasn't stopping at any stations. The landscape outside grew increasingly surreal. Fields of black flowers, rivers that shimmered like liquid silver, and a sky filled with stars that didn't belong. When Samuel tried to ask the conductor where they were going, the man's face seemed to shift, becoming a blur of features. The other passengers began to hum a low, unsettling tune. By the time the train stopped, Samuel was the only one left, and the station was an endless expanse of fog. His ticket was later found, stamped with the words, "One way." The soft hum of the train's wheels blended with the rain, a relentless cadence in the unknown night. In an antique shop, Lily found an ornate mirror with an inscription that read, "See what you fear." The shopkeeper warned her not to hang it in her bedroom, but Lily ignored the advice. That night, as she gazed into the mirror, her reflection began to change. It smiled when she didn't, its eyes filled with malice. The next evening, the reflection spoke, repeating her thoughts before she could voice them. Over time, the reflection began to step out of sync, moving independently. One night, Lily awoke to find her reflection standing beside her bed, whispering, "You don't belong here." The rain outside became a steady downpour, its rhythm like a heartbeat matching the mirror's sinister intent. A factory long abandoned stood at the edge of town, its windows shattered and machinery rusting. Lucas, a night guard hired to protect the site from vandals, was given an old lantern that had supposedly belonged to the factory's last watchman. On his first night, the lantern flickered and dimmed, casting strange shadows on the walls. As Lucas patrolled, he heard faint whispers and the clang of unseen machinery. The lantern led him to a room sealed off for decades. Inside were rows of lockers, each with a nameplate. The final locker bore Lucas's name. When he opened it, the lantern went out, and the room filled with laughter that wasn't his. The rain drummed against the factory's metal roof, drowning the whispers that refused to leave Lucas alone. Beneath the waters of Lake Mercy lay the ruins of a village flooded to make way for a reservoir. During droughts, the spire of the old church would emerge, a reminder of what once was. Mia, a historian, dove to document the village's remains. As she explored the church, she noticed faint chanting echoing through the water. In the bell tower, she found a submerged altar with offerings that looked fresh. Something brushed past her, and when she turned, the villagers were there, their eyes wide and lifeless. They reached for her, their mouths forming silent pleas. Mia surfaced, gasping, but the chanting followed her to the shore. The The rain fell in heavy sheets, the lake's surface rippling as if alive with unseen movements. At the edge of a forgotten village, a bridge stood shrouded in mist. Locals called it the Echoing Bridge, warning that anyone crossing it at night would hear their own voice calling to them from the water below. Emily, a traveling artist, dismissed the tales and decided to paint the bridge under the full moon. As she worked, she heard a faint voice calling her name. When she looked over the edge, she saw her reflection in the water, smiling at her with malice. The reflection spoke, "Come closer." Emily's belongings were found on the bridge the next morning, but the painting was gone, and her voice was said to echo there ever after. The rain began to fall softly, blending with the whispers of the river below. In a secluded monastery, a choir once known for its heavenly voices had mysteriously vanished. Years later, Daniel, a music historian, visited to document its history. As he explored the chapel, he heard faint singing, harmonies so perfect they seemed otherworldly. Following the sound, he discovered a hidden chamber filled with sheet music, each piece marked with warnings in Latin. Ignoring the warnings, Daniel played the notes on the chapel organ. The choir's voices grew louder, but they were no longer heavenly. They were filled with anguish and rage. Shadows filled the chamber, surrounding him as the singing reached a deafening crescendo. The next morning, the chapel stood silent, the organ keys covered in ash. Thunder rolled in the distance, the storm's fury matching the memory of the choir's cries. In a dusty antique shop, Alice found an old key labeled "Yesterday." The shopkeeper warned her not to use it, but curiosity overwhelmed her. That night, she inserted the key into her bedroom door, which opened to a version of her house frozen in time. She saw herself as a child, playing with her late mother in the living room. But as she tried to join them, the scene darkened, and shadowy figures surrounded her younger self. The child turned, her eyes empty, and whispered, "You don't belong here." Alice woke in her bed, clutching the key, which had now turned to ash. The rain outside fell in steady drops, as if counting down the seconds to another realm. A small fishing village was plagued by the legend of the Lantern of Souls. On stormy nights, a ghostly lantern would appear on the shoreline, luring sailors to their doom. Caleb, a skeptic, ventured to the cliffs during a storm, determined to disprove the tale. As lightning illuminated the sea, the lantern appeared, its glow hypnotic. Caleb felt compelled to follow it, descending the jagged rocks. He found a wrecked ship at the base of the cliffs, its crew frozen in time, their faces twisted in fear. The lantern floated toward him, and a voice whispered, "You're the next light." The rain mingled with the crashing waves, hiding the cries of the lost souls below. In the center of a vast forest stood a watchtower built centuries ago. Elena, a wildlife researcher, used it as her base. On her first night, she found an old journal detailing strange occurrences, footprints circling the tower, whispers on the wind, and sightings of a figure in the treetops. At midnight, Elena heard knocking at the door, though no one was there. When she climbed to the top of the tower, she saw glowing eyes staring at her from the trees. The journal's final entry appeared before her eyes, scrawling itself in fresh ink. "Don't look down." The storm raged outside, the winds howling, masking the unseen presence below. At the center of an abandoned village was a well said to grant wishes. At a price, Sophie, desperate to save her ill brother, whispered her wish into the depths. The well's water began to bubble, and a voice promised her brother's health in exchange for something she cherished. That night, her brother miraculously recovered, but Sophie's reflection disappeared from every mirror. When she returned to the well to demand answers, it whispered, "You belong to me now." The rain's soft patter mirrored the well's eerie promise, a sound that haunted Sophie forever. In a dusty attic, Ben found a marionette with intricate details and lifelike eyes. He decided to restore it, but each night he heard faint laughter and the sound of its wooden limbs moving. One evening, the marionette was gone from its stand, and Ben found it sitting on his bed, holding a knife carved from its own wood. The puppet's head tilted, and it whispered, "Your turn." The rain drummed against the attic windows, drowning out the sound of wooden footsteps. In a cemetery known for its strange occurrences, the keeper's lantern was said to glow even when unlit. Marcus, a gravedigger, borrowed it to navigate the grounds one stormy night. The lantern cast shadows that moved independently, forming figures that followed him. When he tried to return it, he found the keeper's grave freshly disturbed, the coffin empty. The lantern grew heavier in his hand, and a voice whispered, "You're the keeper now." The rain fell harder, its sound mixing with faint whispers from the graves. In an old manor, one room was always locked. Visitors claimed they felt eyes on them when passing it. Lucy, the new owner, forced the door open, revealing a room filled with portraits. Each painting depicted someone standing exactly where Lucy was at that moment, their expressions twisted in fear. As she backed away, she realized the newest painting was of her, and the eyes on the canvas moved. The rain tapped against the windows, a soft counterpoint to Lucy's growing terror. In a labyrinthine hotel, room 313 was said to move, appearing on different floors. Jack, a weary traveler, found it on the 13th floor, despite being told the hotel had only 10. Inside, the room was lavish but eerily silent. When Jack tried to leave, the hallway outside led to endless copies of the same door. A voice whispered from behind him, "Stay with us." The rain outside became a relentless downpour, as if trying to wash the hotel away. A hiker named Mia ventured into a forest where no shadows fell, even under the brightest moonlight. As she walked, she felt the air grow colder, and the trees seemed to close in around her. She realized her own shadow was missing, and figures began emerging from the treeless gaps, their forms made of pure darkness. When she ran, they followed, whispering her name. The rain's steady rhythm masked the sound of unseen footsteps closing in. In a snow-covered village, an old bell tower rang only during blizzards. Clara, curious about the phenomenon, climbed the tower during a storm. At the top, she found no bell, only a single rope swaying as if pulled by invisible hands. Each ring seemed to echo with voices crying for help. When Clara tried to descend, she found the stairs endless, the voices growing louder. The next day, her footprints were found leading to the tower, but she was never seen again. The snow turned to icy rain, each drop striking the bell tower like a mournful dirge. In the dead of night, an old radio crackled to life in Sarah's living room. It was a model she'd picked up at a thrift store weeks ago, a vintage piece she hadn't bothered to plug in yet. The voice that came through was soft, trembling, almost pleading. "Please, help me. If you can hear this, I don't have much time." Sarah had just moved into her grandmother's farmhouse after the old woman's passing. The property was isolated, surrounded by acres of overgrown fields and a dense forest. It wasn't her ideal home, but financial struggles left her with little choice. The farmhouse was filled with relics of a bygone era, antique furniture, porcelain dolls, and that dusty old radio. Sarah hadn't paid much attention to it until that night when it inexplicably turned on. At first, she assumed it was a neighboring frequency or a prank. But as the voice continued, her unease grew. "If you can hear me, you need to stay inside. They're watching. Don't go outside after dark." She turned the radio off, shaking her head. It had to be some sort of interference. But as she stood in the silence of the living room, she noticed something strange. Her reflection in the window didn't match her movements. Over the next few days, the broadcasts became more frequent. The voice, always the same man, grew more frantic. "They're getting closer. I don't know how much longer I can keep them away. Please, if you can hear me, don't open the door." not for anyone. Sarah tried to ignore it, but strange things started happening around the house. Doors she'd locked were found ajar. The sound of footsteps echoed upstairs even when she was alone. At night, she heard faint whispers outside her window, though the fields were empty. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the radio switched on again. This time, the voice was barely audible beneath a sea of static. "They know you're listening. They're already inside." Her heart pounded as a chilling realization hit her. The static wasn't random. It was rhythmic, almost like breathing. Determined to understand what was happening, Sarah began researching the house's history. She discovered that her grandmother had always been a private, reclusive woman. The neighbors knew little about her except for one chilling detail. She never allowed anyone into the house after sunset. Digging through old papers in the attic, Sarah found a journal. Its entries were erratic, filled with paranoid ramblings about the Watchers. The last page read, "They come for the lonely. They feed on fear. If you hear the signal, it's already too late." As she read, the air grew heavy. The shadows in the attic seemed to lengthen and shift, pooling in corners where no light could reach. Suddenly, the radio downstairs blared to life. "Run!" Sarah bolted down the stairs, only to find the living room dark and cold. The radio was off, yet the voice echoed faintly, as if coming from within the walls. That night, Sarah locked every door and window, her nerves frayed. The radio remained silent, but the house wasn't. Knocks echoed from the front door, slow and deliberate. Peering through the peephole, she saw nothing but darkness. Then came the sound of scratching, as if claws raked across the wood. Suddenly, her phone lit up with a notification. A missed call from her own number. Before she could react, the radio turned on again, blasting static. Beneath it, she could barely make out the man's voice. "They're inside. Don't trust what you see." Her reflection in the living room window smiled, though she hadn't moved a muscle. In a panic, Sarah fled to the basement, clutching a flashlight. The air down there was damp, and the walls seemed to pulse, as if the house itself were alive. In the far corner, she noticed something she'd never seen before, a trap door. With trembling hands, she pried it open, revealing a tunnel that stretched deep into the earth. As she descended, the whispers grew louder, now coming from all directions. At the end of the tunnel, she found a small room filled with ancient radio equipment. A single note was pinned to the wall. "The signal binds them. Destroy it, or they will consume you." But before she could make sense of it, the lights flickered and the whispers stopped. A voice, calm and familiar, spoke behind her. "We've been waiting for you." She turned, and the flashlight flickered out. Weeks later, the farmhouse was empty again, its windows dark. But at 3 a.m., a faint broadcast emanates from the house's old radio. "Please, help me. If you can hear this, I don't have much time." Locals say no one stays in the house for long, and every time someone moves in, the signal gets stronger, the whispers louder, and the watchers closer. The story begins with a warning no one took seriously. Deep in the forest on the outskirts of the small town of Black Hollow, locals whispered about the cursed Hollow Ones. They said you'd hear their laughter first, followed by the sound of crunching leaves behind you. If you looked back, you'd never make it out alive. Cameron wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories. A photographer by trade, he traveled to Black Hollow to capture its famed autumn beauty, a place where the leaves glowed in hues of gold and red, and the mist rolled in every morning like a soft blanket. He rented a cabin on the edge of the forest, dismissing the old woman's warnings as she handed him the keys. "Don't wander too far into the woods," she said, her voice shaky. "And if you hear laughter, whatever you do, don't look back." He smiled politely, but thought nothing of it. Superstition, he assumed, born from boredom in an isolated town. The first few days were uneventful. Cameron spent hours hiking, capturing the vibrant foliage and breathing in the crisp autumn air. But as he ventured deeper into the woods, he noticed strange things. At first, it was subtle, a sudden silence where birdsong had been moments before, shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally long, even when the sun was directly overhead. Then came the laughter. It was faint, almost like the sound of children playing. Cameron froze, scanning the forest. He hadn't seen another soul all day. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the trees, yet there was no source. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling despite himself. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. It came from behind him. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to run, but his curiosity got the better of him. Slowly, he turned. There was nothing there. The forest felt heavier, the air pressing down on him like a weight. Cameron shook it off and headed back to the cabin, telling himself it was just his imagination. But that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him home. Over the next few days, Cameron became increasingly unsettled. He started waking up to find his camera equipment moved, his tripod set up by the window, pointed toward the woods. One morning, he discovered muddy footprints leading from the forest to his front porch. They were small, like a child's, but uneven, as if whoever made them walked on all fours. The laughter returned every evening, closer and louder each time. Cameron stopped venturing into the woods, yet the forest seemed determined to reach him. One night, as he lay in bed, the sound of crunching leaves began outside his window. It was slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. His heart pounded as he reached for his phone, only to find it dead. Then a knock at the door. It was light, almost polite. Cameron didn't move. The knock came again, followed by a child's voice. "Mister, can you help us? We're lost." His blood ran cold. He knew no child could be out here at this hour. The voice was wrong, too sweet, too rehearsed, like something imitating a child. He didn't answer, and after a moment, the voice spoke again, now from the other side of the window. "Please, mister, let us in." Cameron couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his camera, hoping to document whatever was tormenting him. If he could capture proof, maybe someone would believe him. As he stepped outside, the forest was unnaturally quiet. The air was thick with mist, and his flashlight barely pierced the darkness. The laughter returned, surrounding him. It was chaotic, overlapping voices that twisted and distorted, shifting between high-pitched giggles and guttural snarls. The crunching leaves started again, circling him like a predator stalking its prey. Cameron raised his camera, the flash illuminating the trees in brief, blinding bursts. That's when he saw them. Pale, skeletal figures crouched in the shadows. Their limbs were impossibly long, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. Their mouths were too wide, filled with rows of jagged teeth. And their eyes, dark, empty voids, seemed to suck in all the light. They moved unnervingly fast, darting closer with each flash of his camera. Snap. One was at the edge of the clearing. Snap. It was inches from his face. Cameron ran, the laughter chasing him, echoing in his ears. He didn't dare look back. When the sun rose, a search party found his camera lying in the dirt near the edge of the forest. The last photo showed Cameron's terrified face, his eyes wide with horror, and behind him, a pale hand reaching out of the shadows. They never found his body. Locals say the Hollow Ones take those who look back, trapping them in the forest forever. Some claim they can still hear his screams on quiet nights, mingling with the laughter of the Hollow Ones. The house on Hollow Creek Road was the kind of place you only moved into because you had no other choice. For Rachel and her son Jacob, it was a last resort. Life had been unkind lately, an eviction, a failed business, and a custody battle that had drained Rachel of every ounce of energy and optimism. The house was old and isolated, sitting at the edge of a vast field that sloped down toward a dense forest. The previous owner had vanished under mysterious circumstances, but the real estate agent had been vague about the details. Rachel didn't ask questions. It was cheap, and it was theirs. From the moment they arrived, something felt wrong. The air seemed colder around the house, even on warm days. The creaking floors and groaning walls might have been normal for a house its age, but they sounded like whispers to Rachel, low and persistent, just at the edge of hearing. Jacob, however, was enchanted by the vast backyard and the forest beyond. "Mom, there's a well back here," he shouted on the second day. Rachel followed him outside, her curiosity piqued. Sure enough, nestled at the edge of the forest was an old stone well, its cover long gone, the jagged opening yawning into blackness. A chill crept up her spine as she peered into it. The darkness seemed endless, swallowing the faint sunlight. "Don't go near that, Jacob," she warned. "It's dangerous." Jacob nodded, but Rachel could see the curiosity glinting in his eyes. The nights were the worst. The house seemed alive in the dark, the creaks and groans louder, more insistent. Rachel often woke up in the early hours, her heart racing for no reason she could name. On the third night, she heard it for the first time, the faint sound of dripping water, rhythmic and steady. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the house with an eerie dampness. She thought about the well, its endless blackness, and shivered. Jacob began acting strangely. He grew quiet and withdrawn, spending hours staring out the window toward the forest. When Rachel asked him what he was looking at, he would only say, "The man by the well." Her stomach dropped. "What man, Jacob?" "He waves to me," he said simply, his tone devoid of fear, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Rachel checked outside, but there was no one. She brushed it off as a child's imagination, but the unease lingered. The dripping water sound grew louder each night. It began to sound less like water and more like faint footsteps circling the house. Rachel started sleeping with her bedroom door locked, though she wasn't sure why. One night she woke to the sound of Jacob giggling. It was coming from downstairs. She rushed to the living room, her heart pounding. Jacob stood by the open back door, silhouetted against the moonlight. "Jacob, what are you doing?" she whispered, afraid to raise her voice in the stillness of the house. "He's calling me," Jacob said, turning to look at her. His eyes were glassy, almost vacant. "He says I can play with him if I go to the well." Rachel slammed the door and locked it, gripping Jacob's shoulders tightly. "There's no one out there," she said firmly. "You're not going to that well. Do you understand me?" Jacob nodded, but she could feel his small body trembling. That night, Rachel barely slept, keeping one ear trained for any sound of movement. The next day, she decided to seal the well. Armed with plywood and nails, she covered the opening, driving the nails deep into the rotting wood. She felt a strange resistance as she hammered, as if the well itself were fighting back. When she was finished, she stood back, her hands on her hips, and exhaled for the first time in days. That night, the house seemed quieter. Rachel allowed herself to hope that whatever had been haunting them was over. But just as she began to drift off, she was jolted awake by a loud crash. She ran to Jacob's room, only to find his bed empty and the window wide open. Panic surged through her as she raced outside, calling his name. The forest loomed like a wall of shadows, and the air was unnaturally still. She ran to the well, her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The plywood she'd nailed down was gone, the jagged opening gaping wide once more. "Jacob!" she screamed, her voice cracking. A faint giggle echoed from the well. Trembling, she leaned over the edge, shining her flashlight into the abyss. The beam didn't reach the bottom, but she thought she saw movement, something pale and sinuous, writhing far below. "Mommy," Jacob's voice floated up from the darkness, small and frightened. I'm stuck. Help me." Her breath hitched. "Jacob, hold on. I'm coming." Without thinking, she grabbed the old rope tied to the side of the well and began lowering herself in. The air grew colder the deeper she went, and the smell of damp earth and decay was overpowering. "Jacob, keep talking to me," she called, her voice echoing in the confined space. "I'm here, Mommy," he replied, but his voice sounded wrong. Too calm, too close. She froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The rope jerked suddenly, and she screamed as it began to pull her downward, faster and faster. The flashlight slipped from her grip, tumbling into the darkness below. For a moment she saw them, hundreds of pale, emaciated figures clinging to the walls of the well, their hollow eyes staring up at her. They smiled with mouths full of jagged teeth, their bony fingers reaching for her. The rope snapped and Rachel plummeted into the darkness. The last thing she heard was Jacob's laughter, echoing from somewhere far above. Days later, a neighbor came by to check on the house. The back door was open, swinging gently in the breeze. The well stood uncovered, the rope frayed and dangling. No one ever found Rachel or Jacob, but on quiet nights, the locals swear they can hear a woman screaming and a child laughing, echoing from the depths of the well. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, you can hear the faint sound of dripping water. It began as an urban legend, a strange tale whispered among college students during late-night study sessions and over drinks at dimly lit bars. Everyone called it the Endless Room, a supposedly cursed urban anomaly in the heart of the city. The details varied with every retelling, but one thing remained constant. If you entered a certain abandoned building on the corner of 8th and Vine, you wouldn't come back the same, if you came back at all. Lucas had heard the story 100 times, and like most people, he dismissed it as nonsense. He prided himself on being a skeptic, someone who believed only in what he could see and touch. But when his friend Nate dared him to spend a night in the building, he couldn't resist the challenge. It wasn't just about proving the legend wrong. It was about proving he wasn't afraid. The building was a relic of a bygone era, its crumbling facade swallowed by graffiti and vines. It had once been a hotel, or so the rumors said, but its official history was lost to time. No records, no deeds, just a hollow shell that had been abandoned for decades. Lucas arrived just before midnight, armed with a flashlight, a bottle of water, and his phone. Nate had insisted on coming with him, but Lucas refused. This was something he had to do alone. He stepped inside, the air immediately thick with dust and decay. The faint smell of mildew and rotting wood permeated the space, and the floorboards groaned under his weight. The first few minutes were uneventful. The ground floor was exactly what he expected, an empty lobby with shattered windows, remnants of furniture scattered like the bones of some long-dead beast. He wandered through the space, his flashlight casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. Then he found the staircase. The steps spiraled upward, their edges worn smooth by time. Lucas hesitated for a moment, staring into the darkness above. This was where the stories began to diverge. Some claimed the staircase was endless, looping back on itself like some kind of twisted optical illusion. Others said it led to a single door that could never be opened. He smirked at the thought and began to climb. The first floor was unremarkable. The hallway stretched out before him, lined with doorways leading to empty rooms. Lucas wandered through a few of them, finding nothing but peeling wallpaper and broken glass. He moved on to the next floor, then the next. It was on the third floor that things began to feel wrong. The air grew heavier, almost oppressive, and his flashlight flickered as he stepped into the hallway. This time, the doors were closed. He reached for the nearest one, turning the rusted handle with a creak. The room beyond was identical to the ones he had seen before, except for the mirror. It stood in the center of the room, tall and ornate, its frame intricately carved with patterns that seemed to shift under the beam of his flashlight. The glass was spotless, reflecting not only him but the entire room with eerie clarity. But something was off. In the reflection, the door behind him was closed, even though it stood open in reality. He turned to check, only to find the door had indeed swung shut. His heart raced as he reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Okay, calm down," he muttered to himself, turning back to the mirror. His reflection stared back at him, pale and wide-eyed, his breath fogging the glass. Then it smiled. He stumbled backward, tripping over debris and crashing to the floor. The flashlight rolled out of his hand, plunging the room into near-total darkness. He scrambled to his feet, his breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. When he turned to the mirror again, it was empty. His reflection was gone. He fled the room, slamming the door behind him and bolting back to the staircase. He told himself he was done, that the stupid dare wasn't worth it. But when he reached the stairwell, his heart sank. The stairs didn't lead down anymore. They spiraled upward, endlessly, vanishing into the shadows above. "Hello," he called, his voice echoing off the walls. "Nate, is this some kind of joke?" There was no response, just the faint hum of something he couldn't identify, like distant machinery or the low rumble of a storm. Reluctantly, he began to climb again, each step feeling heavier than the last. He didn't know how long he ascended, minutes, hours, days, but when he finally reached the next landing, he found himself back on the 3rd floor. It was identical to the one he had just left. Same hallway, same doors, same suffocating air. He moved cautiously this time, trying each door as he went. They were all locked. Then he heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like knuckles rapping against wood. It came from the end of the hallway where a single door stood ajar. Against his better judgment, he approached, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The room beyond was empty, save for a single chair in the center. Sitting in the chair was a figure, its back to him. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its head cocked at an odd angle. "Hello," Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure turned slowly, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Its face was a blank canvas, smooth and featureless, save for a gaping black hole where its mouth should have been. It stood, its head tilting even further, as if it were studying him. Lucas ran. He didn't care where the stairs led anymore. He just needed to get away. The laughter started as he descended, high-pitched and childlike, echoing all around him. The staircase seemed to twist and shift beneath his feet, the walls closing in. He tripped, falling hard, his flashlight shattering as it hit the ground. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the lobby. The sunlight streamed through the shattered windows, and the air was still. For a moment, he thought he had imagined the whole thing. Then he saw the mirror leaning against the far wall. His reflection stood in it, grinning, and it wasn't moving. Lucas turned to run, but the room shifted around him, the walls stretching and warping as the laughter grew louder. He screamed as the floor gave way beneath him, plunging him into darkness. The next morning, Nate waited outside the building, growing more anxious with every passing hour. When Lucas didn't emerge, he finally called the police. They searched the building top to bottom, but found no trace of him. The only thing they discovered was an old, shattered mirror on the 3rd floor. The urban legend grew after that, whispered among those who dared to listen. And if you ever walk past the building on 8th and Vine, some say you can see Lucas in the windows, watching, waiting for the next person foolish enough to enter. And sometimes, if you get too close, you might hear the laughter. The village of Greystone was a place forgotten by time. Nestled in a remote valley surrounded by steep, jagged cliffs, it was a place of unrelenting mist and gray skies. Few ventured there, and even fewer left. The only road in and out of the village was a narrow, crumbling path through the mountains, constantly threatened by landslides. Travelers who stumbled upon Greystone often described it as oppressive, a place where the air felt too heavy and silence seemed alive. For the villagers, it was simply home, a bleak but quiet existence. The fog began to change in late autumn. At first, it was subtle. The mist that rolled in each morning grew thicker, lingering longer until the sun could no longer break through. Days became darker, and nights stretched endlessly, with the fog glowing faintly under the moonlight like an unnatural shroud. The villagers whispered to one another, their voices low, about strange shapes moving in the fog, shadows that didn't belong to anything human. Amelia had lived in Greystone her entire life. At 28, she was one of the younger residents, her dreams of leaving the village crushed years ago when her father fell ill, leaving her to tend to the family farm. She wasn't one to entertain superstitions, but even she couldn't ignore the weight of the fog. It pressed against her windows at night like a living thing, and the fields, once familiar and comforting, now felt alien and hostile when she worked them. The animals, usually noisy and restless, had grown unnervingly quiet, their eyes fixed on the mist as if they sensed something Amelia couldn't. One evening, as the village prepared for another cold, damp night, the church bells rang. The sound echoed strangely through the fog, distorted and mournful. The bells never rang except on Sundays, and even then they were a dull, lifeless tone. The villagers gathered in the square, their faces pale and drawn, whispering nervously. Father Mathis, the elderly priest, stood on the church steps, his hands shaking as he clutched a rusted bell. "They've come," he croaked, his voice barely audible over the murmurs. "The ones from the fog." The crowd fell silent. Amelia felt a chill run down her spine. The priest's words sounded ridiculous, but his terror was undeniable. Someone in the crowd asked, "Who's come? What are you talking about?" Father Mathis pointed toward the edge of the village, where the fog seemed thicker, almost solid. "The ones who walk in the mist. They've come to claim us." That night, no one slept. Amelia stayed in her small cottage, every door and window locked, though she wasn't sure what she was locking out. She sat by the fire, her heart pounding with every creak of the house, every gust of wind. Just before midnight, she heard it, a low, rhythmic sound like footsteps in wet earth. She froze, straining to hear. It wasn't just footsteps, there was something else, a faint, guttural noise like a growl. The sound grew louder, closer, and Amelia's blood ran cold as she realized it was coming from all around her house. The fog outside her window seemed to pulse, pressing harder against the glass, and she swore she saw something moving within it. Shapes, tall and thin, with long, spindly limbs. She grabbed the poker from the fireplace, her hands trembling, and waited. The footsteps circled her house once, then twice, and then silence. When dawn broke, the fog hadn't lifted. It was thicker than ever, an impenetrable wall of gray. Amelia ventured outside cautiously, her breath visible in the frigid air. The village was eerily silent, the usual morning sounds of animals and people replaced by a suffocating stillness. She walked toward the square, her boots crunching on the frosted ground, and stopped when she saw the marks. They were footprints, impossibly large, with claw-like impressions at the toes. They crisscrossed the square, leading toward the church. The door was ajar, swinging gently in the cold breeze. She stepped inside, her heart hammering. The interior of the church was dark, the air damp and heavy with the scent of mildew. She called out, her voice echoing, but there was no reply. And then she saw them. The entire congregation, nearly 20 people, sat motionless in the pews, their faces tilted upward. Their eyes were wide and unblinking, their mouths slightly open as if caught in the middle of a scream. Amelia's stomach churned as she realized they weren't breathing. Their skin was pale and clammy, their hands frozen in unnatural positions as though they had been clawing at the air. Amelia stumbled back, her hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. As she turned to leave, she caught movement out of the corner of her eye. One of the figures, seated in the front pew, turned its head slowly to face her. Its eyes were black pits, its jaw distending far beyond what should have been possible. It smiled, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. "Stay," it whispered, its voice a rasping echo. "Stay and see." Amelia ran, the creature's laughter following her out of the church and into the fog. She sprinted back to her cottage, slamming the door behind her and locking it. She sat in the corner of the room, clutching the fire poker, tears streaming down her face. The fog pressed harder against the windows, and the laughter grew louder, joined by other voices, some deep and guttural, others high and childlike. For 3 days, Amelia didn't leave her cottage. The fog never lifted, and the voices never stopped. On the 4th day, there was a knock at the door. It was soft, almost polite. She didn't answer. Another knock came, harder this time, followed by a voice. "Amelia," it called, sweet and familiar. "It's me, Jacob. Please let me in." Her brother. He had died years ago. She squeezed her eyes shut, gripping the poker tighter. The voice grew insistent, pleading, but she didn't move. After what felt like hours, the knocking stopped, replaced by silence. When she finally gathered the courage to look outside, the fog had receded slightly, revealing the village square. It was empty, the church door swinging gently in the breeze. Amelia was alone, or so she thought. That night, the fog returned, thicker than ever. The voices came with it, louder, closer, and accompanied by the sound of footsteps circling her house. They didn't stop this time, and when the first window shattered, she knew she wouldn't survive the night. Amelia's screams were the last sound to echo through Greystone before the fog swallowed the village completely. By morning, there was nothing left but silence, the church bell rusting in the oppressive stillness. Travelers passing through the valley tell of a thick fog that clings to the cliffs, and if you listen closely, they say, you can hear faint whispers calling your name. Nobody ever stayed long in the Marlowe house. Perched on the outskirts of a forgotten town, it sat surrounded by miles of barren fields and a single winding road that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. For years, the house had been empty, its shutters hanging loose, its paint peeling in the relentless wind. But when Claire inherited it from an uncle she had never met, it felt like a strange stroke of luck. She was fresh off a divorce, drowning in debt, and desperate for a fresh start. Free was free, after all. When she first arrived, the house was eerily silent. The front door creaked as she pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty halls. Dust blanketed the floor, and cobwebs hung thick in every corner. The air was damp and heavy, carrying a faint metallic scent she couldn't place. But despite its dilapidated state, the house had an undeniable charm. The wooden banister gleamed under the dirt, and the large windows offered a view of the endless fields that stretched out like a sea of gold. Claire moved in quickly, eager to make the house her own. She spent her days cleaning and repairing, working tirelessly to restore it to its former glory. But as the sun set each evening and darkness enveloped the house, she began to notice things she couldn't explain. It started small, faint creaks in the floorboards when she was alone, the feeling of being watched as she worked. She chalked it up to her imagination, the natural unease of living alone in a large, empty house. But the noises grew louder. Late at night, Claire would hear footsteps in the hall outside her bedroom. She would lie still in bed, her breath shallow, clutching the covers as the sound moved closer, stopping just outside her door. One night, she worked up the courage to throw the door open, but the hall was empty. The only thing she found was a strange pattern of scratches on the floor, long and deep, as if something heavy had been dragged. The whispers began on the third week. Claire was in the kitchen washing dishes when she heard it, a faint, indistinct murmur coming from upstairs. At first, she thought it was the wind, but as she strained to listen, she realized it was a voice. No, voices, several of them, overlapping in a hushed, almost frantic conversation. She crept upstairs, her heart pounding, following the sound to one of the locked rooms at the end of the hall. The key had been missing since she moved in, and she hadn't thought much of it. But now, standing in front of the door, she felt a deep sense of unease. The whispers stopped the moment she touched the doorknob. The silence that followed was deafening. She hurried back downstairs, refusing to acknowledge the cold dread that had settled in her chest. The dream started soon after. In them, Claire was standing in a long, dark corridor. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the wood, and the air was thick with the smell of burning. At the end of the hall, a door stood slightly ajar, a pale, flickering light spilling out. She would always wake up before she could step inside, her body drenched in sweat, the taste of smoke lingering in her mouth. One night, as she lay in bed trying to calm her racing heart, she heard it again, the whispers. But this time they were louder, clearer. They weren't coming from upstairs. They were in her room. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized the whispers were coming from directly above her bed. Slowly, she looked up. The ceiling above her was moving. Shadows writhed and twisted, forming shapes that seemed almost human. Hands, faces, mouths opening and closing in silent screams. Claire bolted from the room, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. She spent the rest of the night sitting on the porch, staring at the house as the windows seemed to watch her back. Desperate for answers, Claire went to the town library the next day. The librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes, grew pale when Claire mentioned the Marlowe house. "You should leave," the woman said firmly, her voice trembling. "That place is cursed. It always has been." Claire pressed her for details, and the librarian reluctantly told her the story. Decades ago, the Marlowe family had lived in the house, parents and 4 children. One night, without warning, the father killed his entire family, dragging their bodies into the locked room at the end of the hall before hanging himself in the attic. No one knew why he did it, but the house had been shunned ever since. "They say the family never left," the librarian whispered. "That they're still in that house trying to finish what was started." Claire returned home, shaken but determined not to give in to fear. That night she heard the whispers again. This time they led her to the locked door. The air in the hall was icy cold, her breath visible as she stood before it. Without thinking, she pressed her hand against the door, and it swung open with a groan. The room beyond was pitch black, the darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the light from the hallway. As she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her, plunging her into darkness. She fumbled for her phone, using its flashlight to cut through the gloom. The walls were covered in the same strange symbols from her dreams, carved deep into the wood. In the center of the room was a circle of blackened candles, melted wax pooling on the floor. And then she saw them, shadows moving along the walls, shifting and twisting, their shapes unnatural. They began to spill out of the walls, forming into tall, gaunt figures with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. Claire backed into the corner, her phone trembling in her hand. The figures moved closer, their whispers growing louder, overlapping into a deafening roar. "You shouldn't have come," one of them rasped, its voice like broken glass. "You shouldn't have stayed." The last thing Claire saw before the phone slipped from her hand was a pale, skeletal face inches from her own, its empty eyes staring into her soul. When the house was finally sold years later, the new owners found no trace of Claire. But they did find the locked room. The walls were blank, the symbols gone. The only thing in the room was a circle of blackened candles and a faint whisper that seemed to echo through the empty house. "Leave."